Hi, my name is Leslie Ayers. This is Sociology. This is my speech over heritage. My audience is my daughter Miley for the day. So, beginning to talk about heritage, we will mention the family tree. A family tree, by definition, is a chart representing your family members in a structure, appearing as a conventional tree. In the family tree, you can place data for each family member to help you discover who they are to you and where they come from. The family tree also helps you identify patterns in family abilities, such as a career choice. For instance, in my family tree on my father's side, all the men except for my father, which is your grandfather, served in the military. I chose my oldest family member, who is my grandmother on my maternal side, my mom's side of the family tree, to interview her to find out more information about my family tree because I didn't know much about my family tree. I chose my grandmother. Her name is Donna. She is 89 years old and still living on her own. She's probably the most knowledgeable in our family and has the most history of it. She was eager to complete the interview and tell her version of the story of our family. She was asked several questions, and these are the summary of her responses to those. My grandmother's definition of culture, she stated, was where we are from and our religion. She stated when thinking of the word family, the first thing that came to her mind was those that she is close to and can rely on the most. The way she viewed family status surprised me. When asked who holds the most status in our family, she replied, the women, of course, because they're very strong and successful. When I asked her what she meant by success, she replied, it's when you set a goal you achieve, and on the way to that goal, you're happy with it. She went on to tell me her mother was the last generation to stay home with their children with no career, and that her dad was a successful carpenter who built their home and many others in the neighborhood where she grew up. Based on the interview, education seemed to be important, at least back to my great-grandparents. I am the first to graduate college, but everyone in generations before me graduated high school. My grandmother went on to talk about what was important to her based upon the meal of the day and punctuality. She stated the most important meal of the day is breakfast. I am never late. It shows reliability in myself. My grandmother is she's pretty healthy and she eats healthy. She always watches what she eats. She doesn't want to get fat, as she says. She wants to live a long life, which I think she's done so far. So whatever she's doing is working. Due to high cholesterol running in our family tree on that side, she stays away from fatty foods and eats mostly fruits, vegetables, and lean meats. Moving on, talking about religion and our family's involvement in it, she had a lot to say. Growing up, she was raised in a Pentecost church. This was very different from the way she chose to raise my mother in church. She told me after marrying my grandfather, they decided to become members of a Southern Baptist church in Calvertsville, Indiana. Later, my grandfather served as the pastor there for many years. My grandmother considers religion to be the foundation of our family and is proud that the tradition of attending church has passed down through all of the generations. Our family is very involved in church, with my mother playing the piano and directing the children's choir. The kids and I are members of the worship team there, which I lead every Sunday morning. The roles of men and women in our family were once very different from each other. The men worked to provide for the family or served in the military. The women would stay home and raise the children and keep up with the housework. Once my grandfather came home from the military and started pastoring, my grandmother picked up an office job at the Crane Naval Base. Her status as a military spouse allowed her to gain a position on a military base. Since then, women in the family have had full-time careers as well as the men, and both spouses would raise the children together. English is our spoken language in our family and culture background. Although my great-grandparents on both sides of the family tree came from non-English speaking countries. My family's religion in the basis for our holidays is very prominent. Our holidays that are most celebrated would be Easter and Christmas, due to the birth and the resurrection of Jesus. Physical contact is very acceptable in our family, such as embracing and hugging each other, kissing each other on the cheek. However, these acts of physical contact would not be appropriate by a stranger. Depending on the circumstance, a hug and a handshake would be acceptable by a stranger. I asked my grandmother what she thought would be most disrespectful against our culture. She replied, destruction of the American flag or Bible. Furthermore, in the social aspect of things, a man or woman would disrespect someone else's spouse or children either verbally or physically, and that would be highly frowned upon in our family tree. We talked about respect for our culture and country, and the first thing that came to her mind was standing for the national anthem, which we have had a lot of problems with in our country in the last few years. So she has found that highly disrespectful. This is something that our country has done for decades to show respect and appreciation for not only the country we live in, but also the men and women who have served and died to defend our country and our way of life. A misconception that people have of the Christian culture is that we are either pushy or just not fun people, which is obviously not the truth. My grandmother has never been in a situation where she has had to experience racism of herself. However, she lived the times of during segregation. The town state in which most of my family has grown up in are largely a white population, 100% in the town that we grew up in. So she never experienced what segregation felt like or had to witness firsthand issues that came from that. Her opinion on what could be done about racism or prejudice is very clear. In her eyes, we are all children of God and all equal. If we could all see that way, maybe the disconnect, hatred, discord amongst each race would not be there. When asked what the best and worst things are about living in the United States, she stated the best was her freedom. The worst was most likely healthcare coverage. In the last questions about feeling excluded and excluding others based on gender or culture, she expressed, there was a time in the 60s where she was the only woman working in an office full of men, pushing the same work through and getting paid next to nothing compared to most of them. She said that was her best example of how she felt about gender and culture and how there was some gender inequality. Step 2 in the family tree or heritage is looking at members on both sides. I could go back to knowing the names of all my grandparents, and I could almost name all of my great-grandparents. and where they came from in their career, but I could only name one great great grandparent. This is due to half of my maternal side dying from alcoholism at an early age, so I didn't know many of them. On my father's side of the family, there was a long history of military careers for the men, with the exception of my father. He's the only one that did not serve, and my brother has not served. The highest level of education on both sides of the family tree was high school before I came along. I was the first to attend and obtain a degree in college on both sides of my family tree. Native American culture goes back fairly close on both sides of my family tree. The closest relative to being Native was my great-grandmother on my mother's paternal side. So it had been my grandfather's side. I had a great-grandfather on my mother's paternal side who was also French-Canadian descent. And my great-great-grandparents on my mother's maternal side were Dutch. On my father's side, my great-grandparents were from Sicily. The social class on both sides of the family tree were pretty even. As far as religion, there was mostly Christian, with my mother's side being Baptist and my father's side being Methodist. Step 3 in the family tree will cover how the tree was influenced, or how it's influenced my life. Most of the influence in my life comes from my mother's side of the tree. I was not surrounded by my father's side of the tree during my upbringing. The family value of our religion has stuck with me over the years. So much of that I have passed on to my children. Now they are highly involved in church on a regular basis. We also value our family time very much, and that is something I think we've all missed with the quarantine going on. Time spent with family is much appreciated. We look forward to lunch on Sundays at my mom's, as we have done for years. We strongly believe in God as our Savior. We believe you should treat others how you would want to be treated and love without prejudice. Traditionally, we get together on birthdays and holidays. Every Christmas, my grandmother, whom I've interviewed, makes roughly 75 cheese balls that she gives to family, friends, neighbors, church family. She's done this for as long as I can remember. We take a family vacation every year. We traditionally pray before each meal and enjoy them together. It's something that I have required of my children, to sit at the table and we eat meals together. We take turns who's going to say the prayer during meals. Most of my family were either military or stay-at-home moms, which I've mentioned before. I have worked since age 15, but had a short stint of 8 months where I did not work, instead stayed home with the kids, finished my associate's degree. My mother was never a stay-at-home mom. My grandmother only stayed home half of her adult life. My mother was very driven, but did not have a college degree. I would like to continue obtaining the highest level of education I can receive, because I want my children to all have amazing careers and obtain college degrees as well, and be an example setter there. My mother broke the cycle of alcoholism in our family. She's the first one to not become a user of the substance. Due to having a high influence of the nurturing aspect of life, none of my mother's side of the family has picked up traits or habits unbecoming of what one would typically think of in a Good Samaritan. Overall, I feel like my family tree is pretty well defined. Understanding where it came from in our culture was easily accessible, as far back to the great-great-grandparent. My grandmother was eager to be interviewed, and this assignment was enjoyable to write about. I hope you all are staying safe and healthy, and this concludes my family tree, and I hope you enjoyed learning about it and its lineage.